They knew she was dying. The Prime Minister had been told. The family was summoned urgently to Scotland. But the world had no idea that September 8, 2022 would be the day Britain lost the only monarch most people had ever known. In her final 24 hours, Elizabeth II faced death as she had faced everything else in her 96 years, with duty, dignity, and devastating loneliness. Now you will hear the part of the story no one ever truly understood. The day began quietly at Balmoral Castle, Elizabeth's beloved refuge in the Scottish Highlands. She had been there since July, longer than usual, and those close to her noticed the changes. She was frailer, more tired, moving more slowly through the rooms she had known for 70 years. But on the morning of September 8, she was still functioning, still working, still the Queen. At 11:30 a.m., she had her final official engagement. Liz Truss, Britain's newly elected Prime Minister, arrived at Balmoral for the traditional audience where the Queen would formally ask her to form a government. It was a constitutional duty Elizabeth had performed 15 times before. Churchill, Thatcher, Blair, Cameron, May, Johnson, and now Truss. It should have been routine. The photographs from that meeting would become iconic for all the wrong reasons. Elizabeth stood in the drawing room, leaning heavily on a walking stick, her right hand visibly bruised and dark. She wore a gray cardigan and tartan skirt, comfortable, informal, unlike the rigid formality of her earlier years. She smiled for the camera, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Those who knew her saw what the public did not. This was a woman at the absolute edge of her endurance. Truss later said the Queen was mentally sharp during their conversation, asking about the energy crisis and offering guidance drawn from 7 decades of experience. But physically, Elizabeth was failing rapidly. The meeting lasted just minutes instead of the usual half hour. After Truss departed, Elizabeth returned to her private rooms. She would never be photographed again, but the world had no idea what was happening inside Balmoral Castle. As the hours ticked away, by early afternoon, the royal household staff noticed alarming changes. Elizabeth's personal physician, a Ghanaian surgeon named Professor Sir Hugh Thomas, was already at Balmoral. He had been monitoring her closely for days. Her condition deteriorated rapidly after the Truss meeting. The exertion of standing, of performing duty one final time, had taken a catastrophic toll. The decision was made: summon the family immediately. Prince Charles, the heir who had waited longer than any other in British history, was already in Scotland with Camilla. He reached Balmoral quickly, but the others, William, Harry, Andrew, Edward, were scattered across England. Private helicopters and cars were arranged. The palace's careful communications began. Inform the government, prepare the protocols, but tell the public nothing yet. Imagine the scene inside Balmoral as September 8 unfolded. Elizabeth, the woman who had been queen since 1952, knew she was dying. She had lost Philip 17 months earlier and seemed, according to those close to her, almost ready to follow him. The loneliness of sovereignty, carried for 70 years, was finally ending. But on her terms, in her beloved Scotland, in the place where she had always been happiest. Her children arrived throughout the afternoon. Charles, of course, was at her bedside. Anne, who had been staying at Balmoral, never left her mother's side. Andrew and Edward arrived by helicopter around. The Queen's closest family surrounded her, but there would be notable absences that would fuel speculation for years to come. Prince William was racing to Scotland, his helicopter delayed by weather and logistics. Prince Harry, separately, was also scrambling to reach Balmoral, but Meghan was not invited, a decision that would later cause enormous controversy. The Sussexes' fractured relationship with the family meant that even in death, there was division. What happened next would be debated, analyzed, and mourned by millions who felt they knew this woman they had never met. At 3:10 p.m., Buckingham Palace issued a statement that sent shockwaves globally. The Queen's doctors are concerned for Her Majesty's health and have recommended she remain under medical supervision. It was unprecedented language. The palace never discussed the Queen's health. For them to make such a statement meant only one thing: prepare for the worst. The BBC interrupted regular programming. News anchors changed into black clothing, a protocol established years earlier for exactly this moment. Crowds began gathering outside Buckingham Palace in London, even though Elizabeth was 500 miles away in Scotland. The world held its breath. Inside Balmoral, Elizabeth was slipping away. Those present described her as peaceful, not in pain, simply fading. She had refused hospitalization. She would die at home, as she wished. Her faith was strong. She had always been deeply religious. The Archbishop of Canterbury was not present, but prayers were said by her bedside. According to those who were there, Elizabeth's final hours were marked by extraordinary calm. After a lifetime of public performance, of never showing emotion, of subordinating every personal desire to duty, she was finally truly private. Only family, only those who loved her not as queen but as mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. Charles held her hand. Anne refused to leave the room. They spoke to her, though it's unclear how much she could hear or respond. The woman who had reigned longer than any British monarch in history, who had met 12 American presidents and 7 popes, who had overseen the transformation of an empire into a commonwealth, was spending her final moments as simply Elizabeth. Not Elizabeth II, not Elizabeth Regina, just Elizabeth. And what happened next would mark the end of the Second Elizabethan age and the beginning of something uncertain and new. At 6:30 p.m., Elizabeth II died peacefully at Balmoral Castle. The official time would be recorded exactly, but those final moments were kept private by those present. No details were shared about her last words, if any, or her final expressions. The family maintained the dignity and privacy she had demanded her entire life, but the world did not know yet. For 90 minutes, Elizabeth had died, but Britain still had a queen. The protocols, established over decades and refined to precision, were activated. Operation London Bridge, the code name for procedures following the Queen's death, began silently and efficiently. Charles, now King Charles III, though not yet proclaimed, made the necessary phone calls. The Prime Minister was informed first, then the Commonwealth realms, 15 countries, where Elizabeth had been head of state, then senior government officials. The machinery of transition, planned meticulously for years, was in motion. At 6:30 p.m., as Elizabeth died, Harry was still in the air, racing to Scotland in a private plane. He would land at Aberdeen just after 8:00 p.m. and be driven to Balmoral. Arriving around 8:45 p.m., minutes after the palace had publicly announced her death. He never saw his grandmother alive, one final time. Whether he could have arrived sooner, whether the family delayed telling him, whether Meghan's exclusion contributed to communication failures. All of this would be debated endlessly afterward. William had arrived at Balmoral around 5:00 p.m., just in time to say goodbye to the grandmother who had been his greatest supporter after Diana's death. Andrew and Edward, already present, were able to be with their mother at the end. Sophie, Edward's wife, who had become one of Elizabeth's closest confidantes in later years, was also there. At 6:32 p.m., just 2 minutes after Elizabeth died, the official notification system began. The royal household's website went dark. Buckingham Palace staff were told, Government officials received encrypted messages. Media outlets were alerted on embargoed terms. Prepare, but do not publish yet. But no one knew the real consequence of those final moments, or what Elizabeth's death would mean for the future of the monarchy. At 6:30 p.m. exactly, as planned years in advance, a private notice was placed on the gates of Buckingham Palace. It was raining in London, pathetic fallacy, in the most literal sense. The notice, in simple black-bordered text, announced the Queen's death, but the public announcement came via less traditional means. At 6:30 p.m., the BBC's news alert flashed across millions of phones. Queen Elizabeth II has died. Social media exploded instantly. Within seconds, the news had reached every corner of the globe. The longest reigning monarch in British history was gone. The BBC broadcast switched to Hugh Edwards in a black suit and tie, announcing the news with the gravitas it deserved. Newspapers, already prepared with obituaries written decades earlier, updated their front pages. Television networks worldwide interrupted programming. In New York, the Empire State Building would light in purple and silver. In Paris, the Eiffel Tower dimmed its lights. The world mourned. Charles, now king but not yet comfortable with the title, released a statement. "The death of my beloved mother, Her Majesty the Queen, is a moment of the greatest sadness for me and all members of my family. We mourn profoundly the passing of a cherished sovereign and a much-loved mother." The formality was necessary, but those close to Charles said he was genuinely devastated. Whatever complications their relationship had contained, he had loved his mother deeply. William, now heir to the throne and Prince of Wales, issued his own statement speaking of grief and gratitude. Harry, arriving at Balmoral alone after she had died, was described by staff as in shock. The complicated relationship between Harry and the institution had meant he was on the outside even at this crucial moment, a fact that would haunt him. The night of September 8 was unlike any Britain had experienced in 70 years. The last time a monarch died, in 1952 when George II passed, the world was different. No internet, no social media, no instant global communication. Now the grief was immediate, shared, and overwhelming. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Despite the late hour and the rain, they stood silently, many crying, some laying flowers even though the gates were closed. Strangers hugged. The British, not known for public displays of emotion, wept openly. It wasn't just about Elizabeth personally, though millions felt genuine affection for her. It was about the end of an era, the loss of the only constant many had ever known. And what happened next would show how prepared or unprepared Britain was for a world without Elizabeth II. September 9 dawned with Britain in official mourning. Flags flew at half-mast across the country and the Commonwealth. Charles was proclaimed king in a ceremony at St. James's Palace, ancient, formal, constitutionally necessary, but emotionally jarring. The Queen was dead. Long live the king. The phrase, repeated for centuries, felt wrong somehow. Elizabeth had been queen for so long that imagining anyone else felt impossible. The 10 days between Elizabeth's death and her funeral became a period of collective mourning unprecedented in modern times. Her coffin was brought from Balmoral to Edinburgh, then London, then Westminster Hall, where she lay in state. Over 250,000 people waited in line, some for over 24 hours to file past her coffin and pay respects. The queue became a phenomenon, a shared British experience of grief and gratitude. On September 19, the state funeral at Westminster Abbey brought together 2,000 guests, including presidents, prime ministers, royalty from across Europe, and representatives from the Commonwealth. The service was watched by an estimated 4 billion people globally, perhaps the largest audience for any event in human history. But those who knew Elizabeth said she would have found the fuss uncomfortable. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, had never sought adulation, had always seen her role as service rather than celebrity. The 10 days of national mourning, while moving and genuine, would have seemed excessive to her practical, duty-focused sensibility. The details of her final day remain partially private. The royal family has not shared everything. Her last words, if any, her final requests, the specific medical crisis that ended her life. This privacy is intentional and perhaps appropriate. Elizabeth lived her entire life in public. She deserved to die in private, but certain things are known. She died peacefully, without apparent pain. She was surrounded by family in the place she loved most. She had completed her final duty, receiving the Prime Minister, just hours before. She had reigned for 70 years and 96 days, longer than any British monarch before her, and she had lived to see her son become king, ensuring the succession she had dedicated her life to protecting. Those closest to Elizabeth said she had seemed ready to go after Philip's death in 2021. The partnership that had sustained her for 73 years was broken. She continued her duties because that was what she did, duty before everything always. But the spark had dimmed at Balmoral in September 2022. Perhaps she finally gave herself permission to rest. The question that haunted many: did she die with regrets? Had she reconciled with Harry, or did their fractured relationship remain broken? Did she worry about Charles's ability to modernize the monarchy? Did she fear for the institution's future in an increasingly Republican age? Did she wish she had been warmer with her children, more present as a mother rather than as queen? No one knows. Elizabeth kept her feelings private her entire life. If she had regrets, she took them to her grave. If she had fears for the future, she never voiced them publicly. She died as she lived, maintaining the dignity and mystery of the crown, never letting the public see the private woman behind the role. The final 24 hours of Elizabeth II's life were, in many ways, a microcosm of her entire reign. She performed her duty until she physically could not continue. She maintained protocol and dignity even as her body failed. She kept her private thoughts private, her emotions controlled, her focus on the institution rather than herself. She died at home, surrounded by family, but still alone in the way that monarchs are always ultimately alone. Britain woke on September 9 to a world without Elizabeth II. For millions, she had been the only monarch they had ever known. She had been a constant through World War II, the Cold War, decolonization, the rise of the internet, and global pandemics. She had reigned over 15 prime ministers and met 12 of 14 U.S. presidents from Eisenhower to Biden. She had been a symbol of stability, continuity, and service. Her final 24 hours, September 8, 2022, marked the end of the Second Elizabethan age. The transition from Elizabeth to Charles was constitutionally seamless, but emotionally seismic. The monarchy continued, but it had fundamentally changed. The woman who had embodied it for 70 years was gone. Those final hours at Balmoral, with family gathering, with the world waiting, with Elizabeth peacefully fading into history, represent both an ending and a question. She gave everything to the role of monarch: her youth, her privacy, her personal desires, ultimately, her life. Was it worth it? Did the institution justify the sacrifices? Will the monarchy she dedicated her life to preserving survive another generation? Elizabeth would say yes. Service was everything. Duty was paramount. The crown must continue. But in those final hours, as she slipped away in the Scottish castle she loved, perhaps she was finally truly free, free from the weight of the crown, the burden of expectation, the loneliness of sovereignty, free to simply be Elizabeth, at peace, going home to Philip. The Queen's final goodbye was characteristically private, dignified, and devoted to duty until the very end. She reigned for 70 years, she served for 96, and on September 8, 2022, she finally rested